The second unit that we cover in U.S. history is, we call it the Gilded Age. And so the first thing I want us to get here are the years. And honestly, if you look up these years on the internet, you're going to see a variety of different answers. But for our class, this is roughly from about 1870 to about 1900. All right? And with the Gilded Age, I want you to kind of understand the big things that are going here. We're getting major industrialization. Okay. We're getting a lot of immigration. We are also going to get our first immigration laws. And we will also see large urbanization, a mass movement into the cities. And we refer to this time period again as the Gilded Age, but you may need to also kind of understand this time period is something that we can also say as being the new industrial age. Okay, now to go on and get started with our first page of review, we have this first box up here on the top left, just some characteristics of the Gilded Age. I have the years again written right there. We have a form of government called laissez-faire. Okay, this is also called laissez-faire. However you say it is perfectly fine. Laissez-faire actually means to leave them alone. Let them do as they please. And so when we apply this to how our government operates, what we mean is, I'm going to jump over here to where it has laissez-faire again. The government is keeping their hands off. They're leaving, specifically, I want you to know, they are leaving businesses, which in return also means our economy, alone. That they're going to have what's called a free market. They're just going to let competition between businesses keep prices at bay and things like that. Now, there's some good things that come with having a more hands-off approach from government, but there's also some negative things that can really get out of hand if we have a laissez-faire type of government. So back over here to Gilded Age characteristics, Mark Twain is actually the one who nicknamed this time period. And what gilded means, it means to like cover in a layer of gold. And the reason that this time period is nicknamed the Gilded Age is because if you looked at the economy of the United States of America, like if you looked at America on paper and our value and what we were doing, it looked really, really good. Our economy was booming, businesses were thriving, especially some of the more important industries like oil and steel and things like that. But the reason it's called gilded, again, when you just look at that, it looks good. But if you actually went into the cities and you looked at what our cities were like, there were some pretty terrible things going on. There was really bad working conditions, really bad living conditions, and things like that. So that's where it turns, it gets that name gilded, is on paper, on the surface, we look really good, but once you dig deep into our country, you can find that there's a lot of filth and a lot of nastiness going on. The next one, again, another characteristic of this time period, we get some major businesses thriving during this time period. We get large companies, we get corporations, monopolies, and our text tends to kind of use the word monopoly and trust interchangeably. There is a difference, but you can honestly kind of think of them as being the same thing. So I honestly teach my class monopoly is a trust and a trust is a monopoly. Okay, it really cuts down on a lot of confusion. Most of the population are going to live in urban areas, and the main reason they are going to move to the cities, and again, this is the correct answer for any time period that we're going to discuss, any person, immigrant we're going to discuss, if you are asked why did they move to the cities, the number one reason is because of job opportunities. And another way of saying that is for economic, so you can think money, economic opportunities. And another reason we get so many people moving from rural areas to urban areas is because of the mechanization of farming equipment. Which means that as technology gets better and we get better farming equipment, what used to take a lot of people to run a farm, especially these larger farms, it's not going to take so many. Okay, a lot of the work is going to be replaced by these technologies. And so a lot of farmers who are going to completely give up that career or either are no longer going to have a job because they're not needed, the only other option that they really have is to migrate into the cities where there are plenty of jobs in these factories, in these industries. And then, of course, the last characteristic, our economy was good. Businesses were thriving. And to be honest, one of the main reasons that the biggest industries were thriving so much is because government was keeping their hands off. All right. Now, over here in the box to the right, where we've already highlighted laissez-faire, government keeps their hands off, up underneath that are some characteristics, good and bad, of what happens when we have a hands-off type of government. So the first one that we have, typically, we see a lot of tariffs being raised, being put in place. And the reason for these tariffs, please remember, a tariff is a tax on imported goods. And what this does is it makes foreign product. It makes foreign products more expensive. And you may be thinking, well, why in the world would we make products that we buy more expensive? So the purpose of a tariff is to actually encourage Americans to not buy those foreign products, but to buy the same product from an American company. And that's going to help American industry, and in return, that's going to help boost our economy. So that's what the purpose of a tariff is. And just to review this, please make sure that you understand we can't just put tariffs on everything. Because that's what a lot of my students kind of suggest. Well, if that's the case, why don't we just put a tariff on all foreign goods? That way Americans only buy from American companies. The reason is because American companies also sell to other countries. And when we raise tariffs on other countries, they retaliate by slapping a tariff on us. And what it is called is a retaliatory tariff. So we have to be careful. We can't just slap a tariff on everything, because that country may respond by putting a tax on a product that we're trying to sell them. All right. The next one, kind of right over it, but you can still see it, is working conditions. Working conditions are extremely dangerous There's no safety codes in place. The only reason we have safety codes in businesses and in industries and factories today is because the government is no longer hands off. They have actually made certain safety procedures, certain clothes and hard hats and steel-toed boots, safety goggles and things. All of those have been put in place by the government. But back during the Gilded Age, when the government was hands off, none of those were in effect, which means working conditions were very dangerous. Wages were very low because today, where we have a minimum wage, which yet again was mandated by the government, did not exist back then because the government was hands off. So wages were very low. Child labor was very common, especially in industries like the coal industry. Children were used to work in these coal mines, and it was extremely dangerous in these coal mines. And long hours, and there was no such thing as getting paid overtime or anything like that. You were still paid those extremely low wages for several hours every day, 6 or 7 days a week. The living conditions in a lot of these cities, a lot of people, especially immigrants, lived in something called tenements. And tenements is going to be the word that you are most likely going to see on state tests. The word that we are more familiar with would be apartments. These are those one-room apartments that these people would have to pay rent to stay in. They needed to live in these apartments because they were close by to whatever factory they were working in. And to kind of make rent cheaper for the individual, you would try to get as many people in one room as possible. That way you could split the rent amongst how many people are actually staying there. So we get really, really cramped tenements, and there's not going to be really good plumbing going on in these tenements either. And because things are so cramped and overpopulated, sicknesses and diseases are going to spread rampant through these tenements. Okay, they were just nasty. It's the easiest way to put it. Another thing that we get, because there are no regulations on businesses, are monopolies. And what monopolies do, first and foremost, they typically eliminate their competition through what we call cutthroat methods. It's very aggressive. Honestly, it's not seen as being very fair. And as a monopoly, if you don't have any competition, you can raise your prices because you are not worried about somebody going to your competition for a cheaper price. Again, you have no competition. Typically, you pay your workers pretty low wages. You're not worried about spending the money to make your work environment safe. But one good thing that you do is you provide a ton of jobs, which is good for our economy. We need people working. We need people making money. We need them spending that money. That is what kind of keeps our economy going in a good direction. So, how I explain what a monopoly is I typically choose a product that is in high demand. And so sometimes I say vapes, because sadly that is in high demand right now. But it can be anything. Just going with what a vape is. If I'm the only person that owns a company that makes vapes and sells them, I have a monopoly over that product, which means I have no competition. I am the only person that you can purchase that product from. And so, if you want to vape, you actually have to buy that product from me, and I can jack the prices up as high as I want them, because if you want the product, you're going to pay whatever price I put on it. Okay? Now, how I would kind of eliminate my competition if a person in your city or in your state decides that they want to start up their own vape company and they want to give me a little bit of competition, well, since I am a large and successful company, what I will do is I will move in to wherever that competition is. I will sell the same product, which again, we're using vapes, but in that region, I will drop my vape prices so low. That way, when people go to the store and they look at buying my vape versus my competitor's vape, my price is much cheaper than theirs. Now, what I'm trying to do is I'm going to pull all of the business away from that company that is now my competition. Now, am I going to lose money? Absolutely. I'm going to lose money, but as a large company, I can actually afford to lose a little bit. This small company that's kind of starting up and trying to compete with me, they can't afford to do that. They cannot lower their prices to be lower than what I have put in that region. So, as they begin to struggle financially because their business is not being successful because people are buying from me, when their business is on the verge of collapse, I will probably go to the owner of that company and say, hey, instead of filing bankruptcy and losing your company, why don't you just let me buy you out? Which, just so you know, is a very smart business decision. If you are running a company and your company is about to fail and somebody comes in and says, hey, let me buy it, you sell it. You sell it for every dime that you can. So that's what I do. I go in, I say, hey, before you lose your company, just let me buy it from you. And so I buy out my competition. And when I have eliminated them, I can go back to my prices and jack them right back up. That is a cutthroat method. That is one way to establish a monopoly. And we're going to talk about it here in a second. It's called horizontal integration, all right? Now over here, our economy. Our economy was good. Businesses were doing good because, again, what these monopolies were doing at the time, that wasn't illegal. Down here, another thing I told you that we get a lot of are immigrants. This is again, this is kind of one of those things you're going to learn that, hey, this is something that we did that was not necessarily difficult to understand, this concept, but it's easy to forget. And I'm telling you, it is so very important for you to understand the immigrants that we get during the Gilded Age are what we call the new immigrants. Okay? And we're calling them the new immigrants because during this time period, the immigrants that we're getting are coming from a different part of Europe than what we have traditionally gotten before. So, this particular part of Europe that I'm talking about is from Eastern and Southern Europe. Countries, for example, like Russia, Greece, Italy. Now, it's not going to hurt for you to kind of go ahead and note that the more of these immigrants that we get into our country, the more concerned we eventually become with who we're getting. We are getting a lot of Catholics. We are getting a lot of Jews. We're starting to get people that don't fit necessarily in the mold of the United States of America. The two major processing centers that we had for immigrants, the one that we had on our east coast was called Ellis Island, and this is where those Europeans came into. And I love it when history makes things easy for us to remember. Ellis starts with the E, and these Europeans, okay? And what we mean by Europeans, again, Europe is a continent. Countries like Russia, Greece, and Italy sit on the continent of Europe, all right? So that's what we're talking about there. Now, on the other end of our country, on our west coast, we have another processing center called Angel Island. And here we go. Again, I love it when they make it easy for us. Angel starts with an A. and the immigrants that we got were Asians. Specifically, the two main countries in Asia that we're getting a lot of immigrants from, we are getting a lot of immigrants from China and Japan. All right, and to be honest with you, these guys, they look different. They definitely have different religions. They come from different government backgrounds and things like that. Right here, the majority of immigrants are going to settle in cities, and here we go. I've already told you the number one reason anybody ever goes to the cities, whether they are migrating or immigrating, are for jobs. Now, the jobs in these factories that these immigrants are going to fill are unskilled jobs, which is wonderful because the majority of the immigrants that we're getting, they don't have a certain skill that they're good at. Our factories, the skilled work is being done by machines now. So we don't need those. We need an abundance of unskilled workers. So we are going to get a flood of immigrants coming into our country during the Gilded Age. Some of these people are going to come in, and they are going to create what we call ethnic cities. Another name for this are enclaves. So let me put AKA. Another name for is enclaves. And the way I explain this is when these people come to our country, they speak different languages than us. They have different foods that they are used to. And so to kind of settle themselves, when they get here, they settle together. And they create their own little communities, their own little enclaves and ethnic cities. So, for example, Little Italy and Chinatown, those still exist today. And when you go there, that's where you can find some of the best Italian food, some of the most authentic Chinese food. When you go into Chinatown, it is literally almost like you are stepping into a little piece of China. So when they came here and they brought their ways of life, their culture, their ways of thought with them, they just settled together and continued to do life like they always had, even though they were here in the United States of America. And that's where we get these ethnic cities. The next thing that you need to understand, okay, and I'm going to highlight push and pull. This is a concept that you can see repeated throughout this throughout this class, is the push and pull effect. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to kind of split this and turn this into a T-chart. What they like to do on state tests every now and then is to put a chart that is blank on there and give you things listed off to the side. And you have to put those things in the chart where they belong. Well, one of the charts that they may use is a push and pull effect chart. And instead of telling my students to remember all these very specific details, I asked them to remember, like, hey, the push, that's the bad stuff. So if it is something that is bad, put it under push. Okay? For push, these are the reasons why these immigrants are leaving their country. These are the bad things going on in the country that they were raised in, that they were living in, that they want to get away from. So you can see like land shortage. There's not enough land. They're being forced to serve in the military in those countries. Famine, not a lot of food. Religious oppression, especially for the Jews being mistreated because of their religious views. Oppressive governments, okay, abusive governments. Those are all bad things. Those are all push effects. And the pull, that's the good stuff. And for immigrants, the pull, these are the reasons why they came to the U.S. These are the good things that we had to offer for them. Number one, most important, was jobs. Number two actually kind of goes with our last unit. The Homestead Act, when we gave 160 acres out on the Great Plains, we actually sent advertisements to other countries telling them, like, hey, come to America and you can have 160 acres. That's how much we wanted to fulfill that manifest destiny. So, a lot of them came over here as an opportunity to be able to own their own land, new opportunities, religious freedom over here, and our government itself being a democratic government where the people are the ones who get a lot of say so in how our country operates. So, that's it for that page. Moving on to the next. These things on this page are so very important, guys. Go ahead and highlight the title of each one of these boxes here. The first one, guys, the social gospel movement. This is a movement that was done by Protestant Christians that focused on good works. Let's circle a couple of things, guys. The name, gospel. Okay? The gospel, and then right here, this is focused around the religion of Christianity. And the main thing that they wanted to do with this movement is they wanted to help better the conditions in the cities. All right, and they want to do it based off of their religious beliefs of helping the less fortunate. So a couple of organizations that were created that were Christian-based, are Christian-based, were the YMCA and the Salvation Army. In YMCA, there was a YWCA back in the day as well, but YMCA stands for Young Men's Christian Association. And then the Salvation Army, which y'all all seen the Salvation Army before because they're the ones who around Christmas they stand in front of Walmart and they jingle their little bells asking you to donate money, and you can go to facilities that are owned by the Salvation Army where they sell products like clothes, home goods and things like that for extremely, extremely cheap. And so these organizations still exist today, and they try to help the less fortunate. The reason things are so cheap in the Salvation Army is because some people cannot afford to go and pay full price for those products. So you can go to the Salvation Army and get a used product for, again, next to nothing. It's helping there. But I will say, the most popular thing that pops up about the social gospel movement was the creation of settlement houses by a lady named Jane Addams. Okay, her settlement house is going to be called Hull House. It was first built in Chicago. I actually have a picture of Hull House right down here. And the main focus of the Hull House, to be honest with you, was to help immigrants adjust to American society, all right? They offered daycare. They offered information on job opportunities. They also are going to offer, so I have daycare, info on job opportunities, and they're also going to offer like English classes. And that is going to really help a lot of these immigrants coming into our country that do not speak English. It's just going to be better for them to adjust if they do learn basic English. All right, the next one here, we have nativism. Nativism how we define it in our class for this unit. This is the dislike of immigrants. Technically, nativism is where you favor the native-born people over foreigners, okay? And if you are born and raised in the United States of America, then you are native to this country, all right? But to kind of cut down on that confusion, nativism is the dislike of foreigners, the dislike of immigrants. Now, there is another word, and we need to go ahead and get it, all right? There is another word called xenophobia. Probably pronouncing that wrong, but it doesn't matter. Xenophobia, okay? And what this is, the word phobia really helps you here. This is a genuine fear of foreigners. So there's a difference in just not liking foreigners and having a genuine fear of foreigners. Like, you think they're here and their way of life is going to hurt you. It's going to hurt this country. There's a difference, all right? Now, what we're going to see for the first time ever in American history, we're going to see that a lot of nativists who dislike these immigrants are going to want to push for immigration laws, because in America, our borders had always been open. You could come to the United States of America with very, very strict regulations on what you had to have. So the very first two laws that we passed that actually is going to keep certain immigrants out is going to be the Chinese Exclusion Act. And then there's going to be something else passed or agreed on called the Gentleman's Agreement. The Chinese Exclusion Act is actually, the name gives it away, is going to particularly keep out the Chinese. And originally, when this act was put into place, the plan was just to do this for 10 years. But they actually renewed this plan several times to where we are not going to allow Chinese immigrants to come into our country again until around the 1940s. The Gentleman's Agreement, this was done by Teddy Roosevelt, by the way, but to make a long story very, very short, this is going to help keep out the Japanese. So our first immigration laws that we ever put in this country, the main immigrants that we are trying to keep out are Asians. The reason is Americans began to get very concerned about our employment opportunities becoming less and less. Also, another issue that we found out, these immigrants, because of such terrible conditions that they were coming from in their own countries, a lot of these immigrants were willing to work for extremely low wages. And we are going to start to see that in these cities and in these factories, workers are going to get tired of those low wages. And they're going to start pressuring their bosses to pay them more. They're going to start threatening to go on strike. They're going to join unions and create unions and things like that. And so if you're somebody who's trying to convince your boss to pay you more, and here comes somebody from another country that's willing to work for next to nothing, your boss is just going to fire you and replace you with that person. They're going to go with the person that's willing to work for less. So a lot of people are going to look at these immigrants and they're willing to work for low wages and them being job competition. And we're going to start to see the first major push to start keeping immigrants out of the United States of America. Now, again, a nativist, this is a person who does not like foreigners. So a nativist, okay, would have definitely supported laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act and the agreement made by Teddy in Japan to keep the Japanese out. Another thing that we get is something called the American Protective Association. This is a nativist group. And this is a nativist group that vows that they are not going to vote or elect any Catholic into public office. And the big deal about Catholics is the head of the Catholic Church is called the Pope. And the Pope is not housed in the United States of America. The Pope is in a place called Vatican City in Europe, and how Catholicism works is the Pope has a lot of say-so and a lot of influence over Catholics. All right? So the genuine concern in our country, where Catholicism was not the main religion, is that if we elect Catholics into public office, if we elect one as president or anything like that, that will actually give the Pope influence in our country, because they have such influence over their followers of Catholicism that it will give them influence in and through our country. All right? Over here, this last little section, there's going to be some very, very specific inventions that have a huge impact on industries during the Gilded Age. And the first one is going to be the light bulb by Thomas Edison. And the light bulb, he perfected the light bulb. He didn't necessarily invent the thought of it, but he's the one who perfected the most efficient light bulb. You've got to know that not only was this Thomas Edison who did this, you've got to know the effect that this had on industry, the effect it had on our economy. And how the light bulb affects industries is now we are going to produce products 24/7. With the light bulb, we are going to see a huge increase in manufacturing of products, because now we can produce products through the night, through the darkest time of the day. And if we can produce more products, we can sell more products, which again is going to be good for our economy. The telephone, this is also going to have a huge impact on our economy, because it's going to make communicating between businesses and things a lot faster. And so if you can get businesses moving a lot faster, get the products produced at a much faster rate, it's going to help our economy. And so how I kind of remember, just a little thing to help me remember, that Alexander Graham Bell was the telephone. I think about a telephone rings. Well, guess what else rings as well? A bell does. Now, the most common invention that is mentioned on state tests is probably the invention of something called the assembly line. And this is going to be invented by Henry Ford. And the assembly line is going to be first used in his industry, which technically is the automobile industry. Cars had actually been around for a little while, but they were so difficult, so tedious to make, that they were too expensive. And so what Henry Ford is going to do is he's going to create the assembly line, which is going to be a more efficient way of making, again, started off with automobiles, making cars, that what this does is it makes products faster. Therefore, it makes the price of them go down. So it makes the products faster and it makes the price cheaper. So what he did is he cut down on a lot of movement. Instead of people moving around, instead of making it really, really difficult for a handful of people to build one automobile top to bottom, he breaks it down into much more simple of a task. He starts to find, the people that are good at doing certain parts of the car, and that's what they're going to be doing in one part of the factory all day long. And then once they are done, that vehicle is going to be moved down to be further assembled by the next person on whatever their job is. Now, guys, we have an assembly line almost in every single factory today because it is the most efficient way to make products. But we also have an assembly line in most of our fast food restaurants today as well. The next process invention is going to technically be called the Bessemer process, and this was invented by a man named Henry Bessemer, and Henry Bessemer is going to start this process in Europe. The man who is going to use this process in America, his name is Andrew Carnegie, and this is a process, okay, to make steel again, and this process is going to be much easier than the ways that we have always made steel. So we're going to be able to make it faster. And here we go again. If we can make it faster, then we can make it cheaper. Steel is a very, very unique kind of metal. Steel is extremely strong, yet it's lightweight. So the significance here is we've been able to make steel, but it was so difficult to make, it was extremely expensive. So now that we can make it faster, we found a better method called the Bessemer process. We can make it a lot faster. It makes it cheaper. Now, what we could not make out of steel, we can do that now because it's affordable. So, for example, things that we can now make down here, I've got this picture. We're going to start to see things like skyscrapers, really, really tall buildings that now, thanks to steel being affordable, we can build the frame out of steel and we can build them really, really high. We're not worried about it being too heavy because steel is very lightweight. So we start to see a lot of skyscrapers spread across these major cities throughout the country. And then, guys, of course, if you go to major cities today, you're going to see a lot of skyscrapers. And the only way that that was made possible was because of the Bessemer process that Andrew Carnegie used here in the United States of America. On this page for the Gilded Age, at the very, very top, we have the 4 most popular monopolies, entrepreneurs, tycoons that there are. So first thing I want to do, let's just highlight their names. The first one here, we have Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and J.P. Morgan. These pictures are of these men later on in age, but I need you to kind of understand that the businesses that they grew, they started as young men and grew their companies to be some of the largest, most successful ones in the country. And the first one I want to kind of go back to is we have Rockefeller. The name of his company is going to be Standard Oil. He is going to have almost a whole monopoly over oil in the United States of America. If you look up the percentages online, they kind of vary, but it's pretty much safe to say at the peak of his company, he controlled around 96, 98, somewhere around there, percent of oil produced in the United States of America. This man had an ungodly amount of money. With his money, it is important to note that he was a philanthropist. And what philanthropy is, I have it down here. A philanthropist is someone who uses their fortune, not all of it, but a lot of money, to help others. They didn't directly hand money to people that were struggling. That's not what philanthropy is, but they use their money to build things like schools, libraries, hospitals, things like that help the public. He used, and this is part of the reason why his company becomes so large and so successful, is he used vertical and horizontal integration. So I'm going to kind of switch colors, but we're talking about these things over here. And again, as he grew his company to be super successful, when it says that he used vertical integration, he gets to the point to where as a company, he owns everything that he needed for his company to be successful. So anything he needed, any process, whether it was transportation, mines, or anything like that, that he needed to make his finished product, he owned all of those processes. Now, what horizontal integration is, another way of forming a monopoly, is when you buy out other companies that are just like yours, and you do this and you eliminate your competition. And again, that's where we get that word monopoly from. Okay, Andrew Carnegie here, he is actually an immigrant. He came to the United States of America with his family as a younger boy, and he was extremely poor, and he worked his way up through the railroad industry at first and then stretched out into the steel industry. And again, the only reason his steel industry was successful is because of the Bessemer process. He actually writes, and I can't remember if it's a book or if it's an article, but it's called The Gospel of Wealth. So I'm going to kind of put it in quotations here. And the Gospel of Wealth is where he talked about how you should not make a ton of money and keep it, that you should use a lot of your money to give to others, not to give to others, but to create better opportunities for others, to help the less fortunate. So yet again, he's the one that really pushes for philanthropy. Cornelius Vanderbilt, okay, he is a railroad consolidator. He's also a philanthropist, and kind of proof of his philanthropy. The only reason that we have the college Vanderbilt is a lot of its initial funding came from Cornelius Vanderbilt himself. The last one over here, to be honest with you, J.P. Morgan winds up being kind of a jack of all kinds of trades. The number one industry that he starts out in is actually in investment banks, the banking industry. And that's a huge responsibility. That's a huge role that he has. I will go ahead and note here that J.P. Morgan will eventually buy Carnegie's steel industry. Pretty sure he also winds up buying a whole bunch of railroads and things like that. But the main industry that he starts off with, the main monopoly, is going to be over investment banks, all right? And just to kind of cut to the chase here, the wealthiest, most influential entrepreneur on this list, all right, we're going to put number one, is Rockefeller. And I know he was a philanthropist, and I know he did a lot of good, but I need you y'all to also understand, he's going to be the number one cutthroat competitor. He was the one that was very much known for when an oil company started competing with him, he would move in, drop his oil rates very, very low, cause that company to nearly go bankrupt, and then come in and buy that company out. So that's just one example of many things that he did that, to be honest with you, if you were him, it kind of just seemed like, hey, I can do this, so I'm going to. But to other people, especially like the smaller oil companies that were being taken out of business because of him, this wasn't necessarily fair, all right? And on those same lines here, this is kind of where we get this theory called social Darwinism. And what this theory comes from is it actually comes from Charles Darwin's, all right, and there's some science for you. Charles Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest. And Charles Darwin's theory was about animals and survival of the fittest. You can kind of think of the food chain. That the animals that are at the top of the food chain are typically smarter, they're more agile, they're just better, okay, physically and mentally. And so we're taking this theory, and instead of talking about animals, we're talking about society. We're talking about people. And to be honest with you, these men up here, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Morgan, they did not feel guilty about their success. They did not feel guilty about their wealth. They believed in social Darwinism, okay, that some people have the, I'm going to underline them here, they have the skills, they have, to be honest with you, the luck, they have the work ethic to be on top, to be successful. And that's the reason these men believed, like, hey, I have a successful business because it's just who I am. And again, guys, this theory is the theory that they use to justify their wealth. All right? So again, keep in mind that these men did some wonderful things, especially with philanthropy. But they also did some pretty bad things as well. So I'm going to change my highlighter here. And so, to be honest with you, they kind of started to gain the reputation of either being a robber baron or a captain of industry. Now, you're never going to see a question that says, was Andrew Carnegie a robber baron or a captain of industry? Because this is a matter of opinion. Some people looked at these men as being successful, as doing great things, as building American industry, boosting the American economy, and they were like, they've done some good things. And if that was something that they believed, all right, they would call these guys a captain of industry. I believe these guys were good. But if you were one of those companies that Rockefeller had eliminated and bought out and, nearly made you go bankrupt, you probably didn't have the same perspective. And so you would not have called Rockefeller a captain of industry. You probably would have called him a robber baron. So if it was something that they did that was good, they would earn themselves the nickname captain of industry. But a lot of the bad things kind of earned them the nicknames of robber barons. Because we start to see, and this, guys, oh my goodness, is so very important. We start to see, our government does, that these monopolies are becoming too powerful, and not just powerful in their industries. They're starting to have a lot of say-so over the government. They're starting to have a lot of pull with senators and representatives and even the President of the United States of America. And they're paying off people to do favors for them and their companies to give them even more of an advantage of all of what they already had. And so what we kind of start to see is even government realizes that these companies and these men have way too much power as monopolies. So we get 2 antitrust laws that are going to try to keep monopolies from doing these terrible things that these men have done. The first one was the Sherman Antitrust Act. And again, if you kind of think of a trust as being a monopoly, the name of this law really gives away what this focused on. It's an antitrust, an anti-monopoly, okay? And this is a congressional law, and it was used to break up monopolies. It made a lot of things that they did illegal. And one of the companies that gets broken up with this law is going to be Standard Oil. They are actually going to force Rockefeller, I'm going to kind of shorten that up there, to sell off parts of his company. And what that did is when he actually had to break up his company and sell off parts of it to other people, what this did, guys, very important, this is going to create competition. And competition is what keeps our market fair. It keeps prices at a decent rate because, if you have a business and there's another business in town that's doing the same thing you're doing, the only way that you're going to attract more customers is you better have cheaper prices. So it keeps prices at bay. Now, to be honest with you, the Sherman Antitrust Act was good. A lot of these entrepreneurs are going to kind of find loopholes around some of the laws, and they're going to realize that the Sherman Antitrust Act did not cover as many bases as it should have. So later on, we get, during Woodrow Wilson's presidency, we get another antitrust act that was much more strict, and this is the Clayton Antitrust Act. The next page is all about unions. I kind of hinted earlier that workers are going to start to get fed up with the working conditions. They're going to start to get fed up with the wages, the unsafe conditions, the child labor. Women are going to start to get upset that they're getting paid less just because they are a woman. And so we're going to start to see workers band together and form what we call unions. So up here in the top left-hand corner, we're going to start with the actual definition of what a union is. And this is where workers come together to fight for a common cause. And the biggest issues that workers had during the Gilded Age were low wages, long hours, the unsafe and hazardous working conditions. Some unions are going to address child labor, equal pay for especially women. And so during the Gilded Age, it's good to note that the government, again, even though that they are laissez-faire and hands-off, they supported businesses. They believed that their biggest support for businesses was them keeping their hands off. But they did not support unions. And the reason they did not support unions is you're going to kind of learn down here with tactics that unions used. Sometimes union workers will plan and go on what's called strike, which is basically where they refuse to work. They're trying to kind of hit their boss in the pocketbook, cost them some money, because if they're not producing the goods, then the person who owns the factory isn't going to make any money. So the reason that government does not like that is because they see that as a potential threat to our economy. If goods are not being produced because workers are going on strike, then that is a threat to our economic status. Now, this last little note right here in this first box, unions, they didn't like immigrants. As we discussed earlier about immigrants, traditionally, immigrants are willing to work for lower wages. I think it's also important to note that another reason why unions disliked immigrants is because immigrants were difficult to unionize. And the biggest issue that we're going to have with immigrants is going to be language barriers. So not only did a lot of these immigrants coming into the United States of America, not only were they just willing to work for these low wages because they where they came from, was terrible. But even if they did want to fight for higher wages, they were nearly impossible to unionize because of all the language barriers. And so kind of jumping down into the tactics again, we already know what going on strike is. Sometimes unions, when they would try to get, bring attention to the fact that they needed better hours and better wages, sometimes they would do another form of protest called a sit-in, where they would come to work as if they were going to actually do the job, and then they would sit down and refuse to work. And the reason that they did this, okay, is so they would not be replaced by, and I'm going to draw an arrow down here, strike breakers. So that leads us into this little bottom section here, how owners of these businesses reacted to unions. One thing that they would do is if they hired somebody and then that somebody joined a union and started planning on going on strike, as the owner of that facility, they would probably fire that person as being a troublemaker, and that person's name would wind up on what we call a blacklist, which means that most businessmen would share this list. And so once you fired somebody for being a part of a union and trying to plan a strike and cost you a lot of money, when they would go somewhere else to get a job, their name would appear on that blacklist, and it would be very hard pressed for them to get another job. Another thing that owners would do are lockouts, where they would lock workers out. If rumors started to spread that workers were planning on going on strike and they were planning on doing it a certain day, the owner would lock the workers out, and they would go ahead and replace them with what we have down here, something called strike breakers. I'm going to change my highlighter color here. Guys, this whole section over here on the right, this first little section, I have prominent unions, which are the most popular unions at the time. The first one, the Knights of Labor. The next one is the American Federation of Labor. We have the Wobblies, which is the Industrial Workers of the World. I'm also going to highlight Wobblies right there. And something called the American Railway Union. Now, the first labor union that we get is called the Knights of Labor, and very important for you to kind of just remember the basics of the Knights of Labor. This union was for everyone, and they also focused on, I'm going to kind of bump this down here, on everything. So, what we mean by everyone, you could be a skilled worker, an unskilled worker. They allowed women and they allowed African Americans. So that's what I mean by everyone. You could join the Knights of Labor. And as a member of the Knights of Labor, the things that you focused on the most were things like 8-hour work days to address those long hours. You supported equal pay for women, getting rid of child labor, and creating what's known as worker-owned factories. Now, it's very important for you to understand that this is a very broad focus. And the problem with that is when you have too broad of a focus, it's actually rather difficult to get any changes made. So I'm going to kind of jump to this little middle section here about prominent people. And the first one I want to talk about is Terrence Powderly. And we're going to draw an arrow from the Knights of Labor to Terrence Powderly because he's going to be the president of this union. And then we're going to jump even farther over here and talk about something, some form of violence that breaks out that is connected to the Knights of Labor. And what we see that happens at something that becomes known as the Haymarket Square riot, a lot of workers go on strike, and their main focus is going to be the 8-hour workday. Now, the problem is this initial strike did not involve the Knights of Labor. They just showed up in support of this push for an 8-hour workday. So, around 70,000 members actually joined this strike. So there are a ton of Knights of Labor workers there. Police show up because if there's 70,000 Knights of Labor members and there's other people, you can imagine how many people are there. Police are going to show up and violence is going to break out. Okay, violence breaks out, and if I'm not mistaken, a bomb is detonated. I know some cops are harmed in the making of this situation, but the problem is this really hurts the reputation of the Knights of Labor, and what we see is a major decline in their membership, because what happens, even though the Knights of Labor were not responsible for the violent part of this, what was supposed to be a peaceful strike, because they were there, their reputation got tacked on to being like a terrorist. And so a lot of members of the Knights of Labor showed up to work, and their owners basically put a notice out that if you're a member of the Knights of Labor, you're going to lose your job. You're going to lose your job because they're being connected to cop killers, they're connected to terrorists, and those people aren't going to be able to work in that certain factory. So in order to keep their jobs, a lot of the members of the Knights of Labor just revoke their membership. They drop out of it. So that was the first one. The next one, and probably the most successful one, is the American Federation of Labor. And the president, okay, so that's already highlighted right here. The president is Samuel Gompers. And I'm going to go ahead and draw my arrow from the American Federation of Labor to Samuel Gompers up here. They were a little bit more organized in the things that they focused on. First, they only allowed skilled workers. And you may be thinking, well, what's the significance of that? As a union, if you are a union of skilled workers, you are more likely to get changes made because you have a skill. If you threaten to go on strike as skilled workers, that's going to mean something because you do something for that company that not everybody can do. If you're an unskilled worker and you threaten to go on strike, as a business owner, they're going to be like, okay, well, we'll just go find somebody else to replace you because you don't really do anything. But as a skilled worker, they can't be easily replaced. So the American Federation of Labor only allowed skilled workers. They're going to have a much more voice in change than what unskilled workers would. They did not allow women, and they did not allow African Americans, but they focused on three major topics. They focused on increasing wages, better working hours, and also better working conditions. And so where up here the Knights of Labor was very broad in what they focused on and all the changes that they wanted to make, down here we typically say that these issues that the American Federation of Labor focused on are what we call the bread and butter issues, the basics. Better pay, better hours, and safer working conditions. So when they have a much more generalized focus, there's going to be a lot of better changes being made here. Down here with the Wobblies, they are not the most popular union. As a matter of fact, later on during the World War I, okay, so the Industrial Workers of the World is their initials are IWW. Well, during World War I, they got nicknamed the I Won't Work because they had a reputation of going on strike so much, and that was not seen as being very patriotic during World War I because everything that was being produced was for the war effort, okay? But this is a socialist group, And they wanted all workers to be grouped by whatever industry they worked in and not necessarily divided between skilled and unskilled workers. The last union down here that's extremely popular is the American Railway Union. And guys, it is so very important for you to note how important the railroad is to the American economy at the time. The railroads are what are transporting the majority of goods from place to place. If the railroads stop, our economy will be quick to crash. So, this American Railway Union, just so you know, we're going to come over here again to this middle section. I want you to go ahead and highlight this name, Eugene Debs. And he actually pops up quite a few times in our curriculum, but here he is the first time. He is going to be the leader, the founder of the American Railway Union. And he's honestly kind of known as being a little bit of a troublemaker. And so under this union, it was an industrial union, and it allowed any person working in the railroad industry. So it didn't matter what you did. If you worked for anything connected to the railroad industry, you could join this union. And the main things that they pushed for were better pay and better working conditions. So keep that union in mind. We're going to come back over here to a couple of violent episodes that break out. And there's something that happens in a place called Pullman, Illinois. So we've got the Pullman strike there. Now, in Pullman, Illinois, it's basically a whole town that was owned by one man. He owned the major industry there, which was the Pullman Rail Car Company. They made what we would kind of consider to be first class rail cars for trains. And not only did he own the factory that the majority of the people worked in, he owned all the living quarters and stores and things in town. Like, the whole town was owned by this man. So here's the problem. Something that happens is he cuts wages. So let me get my pen here. He cuts wages for his workers, okay? So just to be honest, that's going to make anybody mad when you cut how much money they make. But food and rent that he also controls the price of in Pullman, Illinois, those prices did not change. So let's make sure we understand what's going on here. He owns the town. He controls prices of everything. He cuts wages for his workers, yet he keeps the price of their rent and their food the same. But they don't have the same money to be able to afford those products. So these workers, obviously, they get mad and they go on strike. Now, here is what happens. When they go on strike, the American Railway Union, led by Eugene Debs, goes on strike with them. And so to bring awareness to how these workers are being mistreated, the railroad industry nearly shuts down. And I just told you, there are literally a handful of industries in this country that if they shut down, if they collapse, our economy is going to take a major hit. And the railroad industry at the time was one of those industries. So now that railroads are shut down, we're going to see that the government's going to actually have to get involved. We're going to see that they are going to get a court injunction to try to end the strike. Their reasoning was because it interfered with the shipment of U.S. mail. And, you know, it's still a crime today to affect anything that has to do with our mailing service and preventing mail from getting to where it's going. And eventually, the federal troops are going to be sent in, and there's going to be an extremely violent end brought to this strike. Now, the last little section, honestly, that I want to cover, it's a little random note over here at the bottom. we get the Congress of Industrial Organization. This is a union that was created way later on in the 1930s during the Great Depression. And what we see today is that the CIO, Congress of Industrial Organization, actually merged with the American Federation of Labor. So on our last page for the Gilded Age, we have one of the negative sides of the Gilded Age is the political corruption on the national and the local level. All right. And a vocabulary word that you do need to be familiar with is something known as the spoils system. Now, this is also known as the patronage system. And what this is this is when people are given government positions. So when somebody's elected, they sometimes get to choose people to do certain jobs, and they give those jobs to their buddies that are not qualified for those positions. Now, the problem with the spoils system, and I want to write this kind of up underneath it, all right? The problem is it makes government not be efficient. Efficient. I think that's how you spell it. Probably not, but efficient. And so we have a lot of people in government and back then, even some senators, because we didn't elect senators back then. They were chosen by other people. And what we see is a whole bunch of people given jobs to make our country run good, to take care of the people, and they're not qualified for those jobs. So therefore, those jobs are not being done very well. So it makes government very inefficient. One thing that we see more on the local level of government corruption is in a lot of cities, we had political machines that were ran by, and I'm going to kind of bring my highlight down here, by party bosses. And all a political machine is, let's not make this complicated. A political machine, this is when a group of men back in the day would band together, and their goal was to gain support for certain parties in local governments. Again, let's not make this hard. A political machine out of New York City, the most infamous is Tammany Hall. And so Tammany Hall, this is going to be a group of men who in New York City, their number one objective was to get certain Democrat politicians elected. And that's all a political machine does, is the men, they try to find ways to win votes to keep certain political parties in office. So this political party, the Democrats, Tammany Hall is trying to keep Democrats elected in New York City. Now, these political machines, the leaders of them are known as party bosses. So, for example, Tammany Hall, who was a Democratic political machine, their boss was named William Tweed, and they often called him William Boss Tweed. And him and all his little running buddies who did a lot of illegal things, those running buddies are often referred to as the Tweed Ring. So, how Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall, one way that these people are extremely corrupt, I'm actually going to circle these two major definitions in the middle here, is these people were known for graft, which means that you use your government position, whatever position you're in politics, to have an influence over other people in order for personal gain. Now, a form of graft is taking what's called a kickback. I'm going to go ahead and highlight this whole definition. This is payment made to someone who negotiated a business transaction between companies, typically illegally. So, let me give you an example. Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed in New York City, he has a lot of pull. And one of the reasons he has a lot of pull is over here to the right. You can see a lot of political machines would target immigrants. And they would meet these immigrants on the docks as they were coming into the United States of America. And the political machine would offer these immigrants places to stay and jobs. And they could do that because these political machines had close ties to factories and these tenements, places to live and things like that. And the only reason that they would target these immigrants, number one, is because they knew that they were desperate, but they would target them and give them favors in exchange for votes. So they'd get all these immigrants, they'd help find them a job because their buddy owns a factory, their buddy owns a tenement, they've got a place to live, and when it came time to vote, this political machine would go out, round up these immigrants, and go stand over them. And that's what you kind of see in this picture here. Stand over them as they cast their vote. And they would literally tell these immigrants, like, hey, I've given you this job. I found you this place to live. And on this paper, I want you to put a check mark by this person's name. You're voting for this person. So that's what we mean by an exchange for favors for votes. Well, back to what a kickback is, because these political machines have so much pull with business owners and other elected officials, they could get projects approved, like building a courthouse in Boss Tweed's situation. He gets the construction company that's building the courthouse to inflate the bill. And so his buddy who owns the construction company charges outrageous prices to build this new courthouse that taxpayers' dollars are paying for. And when his buddy makes all this extra money that he really didn't earn as a construction company, some of that money is going to be kicked back to Boss Tweed. All right. Now, down here, more on the national level, okay? President Garfield. Now, before we talk about him, I kind of want to come up here to this top picture. Typically, after a president was elected, a line of patrons, and you can kind of see the White House up there with all those people in front of it, a line of patrons, a line of supporters would gather outside of the White House waiting for their government position to be given to them. So they believe that they are being rewarded for their support of that president. They believe that they played a role in that president being elected. And so they're in line waiting for their job that they are not qualified for. Okay? Now, President Garfield, he did not agree with the patronage system. And this man right here that I'm highlighting, okay, Charles, I guess his last name is Guiteau. Charles Guiteau is one of those people who's lined up after Garfield is elected. He is waiting on his government position to be given to him because of his support of Garfield. And to make a long story very, very short, he actually really didn't support President Garfield in the beginning. And he was a little disconnected from reality, is a good way, a nice way of saying it. He had zero role in President Garfield actually being elected, but he thought he did. And so when he shows up and he meets with President Garfield, he is not given a job at all. President Garfield, again, didn't really believe in the patronage system anyways. And out of his anger, President Garfield is killed. All right. He shoots him and kills him. It's on a completely different day, but he shoots him and he kills him. And when we have a president assassinated because of the spoils system, because of the patronage system, government kind of realizes, like, okay, this is a little extreme. We probably need to do something about this. And that is where we get what's called the Pendleton, a.k.a. the Civil Service Act, and this is so very important. This is on state tests all the time. All right. It says this is a law passed by Congress, and what it does is it actually requires written competitive exams to be given in order for government positions to be filled. So what this does, I'm going to underline competitive exam. What this does is it actually makes government more efficient, because government officials have to actually be qualified for the jobs that they're given. So if they're qualified, they know what they're doing, and they're actually going to do their jobs well. So I'm going to kind of underline that right here to make sure that qualified people are the ones that's being hired. And this is going to try to help eliminate the spoil system. A couple of little notes out to the side here. I really want to make sure that you highlight this man, Thomas Nast. And Thomas Nast is kind of going back to what we just discussed about Boss Tweed. Thomas Nast kind of started to realize that the people that Boss Tweed was taking advantage of, which was the taxpayers, that a lot of them didn't genuinely understand how they were being taken advantage of. Some newspapers were publishing stories about Boss Tweed and some of his crooked ways. The problem is the majority of the people couldn't read and comprehend what was in the newspapers. So Thomas Nast is going to find a different way to let the taxpayers know that Boss Tweed is ultimately stealing from them. And he does this by drawing political cartoons. And the good thing about a picture or a political cartoon is you do not have to be able to read to look at it and kind of get the message. So he draws several political cartoons exposing how corrupt Boss Tweed is, exposing how he gets these kickbacks by stealing from the taxpayers and things like that. And when word starts to spread and understanding starts to spread about what Boss Tweed is doing, is actually going to lead to his arrest. So it is very important that you know that Thomas Nast played a huge role in drawing these political cartoons, in bringing down one of the most infamous party bosses in American history.